Hi everyone, welcome to the dissertation seminar for this summer. My name is Dr. William Kearns. The first thing I'd like to do is introduce yourself and invite you to get to know me and work with me this summer. As I work with you, there are only actually 2 students so far signed up for this seminar class. The goal here is to get you through your dissertation process. Now, I have not had a chance to get to know you yet, and so I'm not exactly sure where you are in the process. I really don't know you yet. So please reach out to me. I'm not exactly sure if you're on chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, or if you've done the proposal and if you're on chapter 4. So as I make this video, it's kind of a generalized thing that I'm making. I do have videos that I plan to make every week, but I want to adjust my instruction during the summer to your specific needs. There's no point in me doing a generalized overview of the dissertation process if you don't need that. So please work with me here. I'm here to help you. A little bit of a background on me. I do work very closely with students in the PhD reading program. I've guided several students through their dissertation process, either through the dissertation committee or as chair of their dissertation. I have not been a methodologist yet on a dissertation committee, but I have been a member as well as a chair of a dissertation, so please work with me. I just recently finished my second year here at UA Little Rock. My primary background is English language arts as well as reading education. My work experience prior to coming to UA Little Rock, in case you're curious, I've been an English teacher at the high school level as well as a reading teacher and a reading specialist at the high school level. I was also a curriculum specialist at the high school level. All of this was in Central Florida. Eventually, I moved on to Clemson University. Clemson is where I got my PhD in curriculum and instruction. And then I taught for 4 years at an HBCU, that's historically black colleges and universities in Midtown St. Louis, called Harris-Stowe State University, before I came here to UA Little Rock. I know that you guys have been through a lot in the program prior to working with me. I know that you've been working closely with Dr. Layton. He's going to be joining us at times in this course. And I know that you've been working with others. I know that the transitions you guys have been through have been trying. I'm here to make your life a little bit easier. I do not intend for this course to be one where all you're doing is you're turning in a bunch of empty assignments that don't help you toward your dissertation process. I want this to be a course that is all about you finishing your dissertation successfully and in a timely manner. So, as we get on with that, here's something that I want you to know. The first thing I want to do in this little presentation is I just want to go over some of the basics of your dissertation proposal and your dissertation study, how to plan it properly and how to get it through the process. So when you identify a basis for your study, first, you want to identify what is your research gap as well as your problem statement. The research gap in a nutshell means what is there in the research literature that has not been studied quite well enough. It doesn't mean that your dissertation has to be groundbreaking. It does not mean that your dissertation has to be something that totally revolutionizes the field. There are very few dissertations like that do this. Every once in a while, a dissertation comes along. That type of dissertation that revolutionizes the field might win an award for Dissertation of the Year. You don't have to win a Dissertation of the Year award. You just simply have to write your dissertation in a way that is a strong study. It meets basic peer review guidelines. Think of your committee as basically a peer review committee, if you will, and that is good enough to say that you know how to design, implement, and evaluate a strong study. Ideally, it's a study that can result in future publications during your career. When it comes to a problem statement, what needs a little bit of a further study in research and practice? Ideally, your research should inform something about practice. In your field, of course, that would be administration, leadership. type of practice, but it can also be the practice of teaching. But ideally, of course, this being, EDAS, I want you to think about what can inform the leadership in schools a little bit based upon the research literature. What's the purpose of your study? Why are you doing the study? Why this topic instead of another topic? You don't want to just simply tell us that because I want a degree, that's not good enough. Why is this study being stated? And that needs to be grounded in a strong understanding of the research literature. What will you contribute to the research literature as well as to practice in the field? Again, you're not trying to revolutionize it, but it should be grounded in your literature. Now, this being said, notice something. When it comes down to your chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, with chapter 1 being your basic overview of what you're going to be studying, including your research question and your research topic. Chapter 2 being, of course, your literature review. Chapter 3 being your methods when it comes to your overall dissertation proposal. I really want you to be working on chapter 2, even as you're doing chapter 1, because the two go well together. It's kind of hard to come up with a solid research question if you don't have a strong understanding of the literature in the area. What implications do you expect to find? This gets into hypotheses. Now, until you've actually done your study, you don't know exactly what the implications are going to be, but you can certainly make a hypothesis about what you expect to find that will hold implications for your field. Then you want to think about, why is your research study important? How is it possibly going to impact the field in terms of what we understand about administration and what we understand about leadership and leading a school and perhaps leadership theories, that sort of thing. For instance, top-down leadership styles versus distributive leadership styles. Maybe you're looking into that. Or a hot button topic in the field is, of course, the science of reading and study of reading and reading processes. Maybe you could look at this topic from the point of view of leadership, of being a principal or something. There's all kinds of possible topics that you could look into. I don't know you well enough, so for all I know, you might already have a topic. So this is why I want you to please reach out to me. I'm making this video again, like I said, before you've had a chance to reach out to me, before I've had a chance to get to know you. So hopefully this video will help you a little bit. From there, we want to think about, what is the research problem? Your research problem forms the target for your study. There's no point in asking a research question if you can't say, okay, what problem in the field does this address? How am I going to address it? How am I going to have research that in some way does inform practice? That's praxis, right? So you always need to be thinking about, how does this inform practice, but also how does this inform the research literature? A lot of times a difficulty that longtime practitioners have is thinking like a researcher, because a lot of times the questions that I've received from my doctoral students that I've been working with in the reading program oftentimes are practitioner oriented. For instance, how do I do professional development? Or how do I implement a professional development study that is more effective? Well, that's a practitioner question. But if you then gear the research literature toward, what can we learn about theories of professional development, for instance, and what can we research about understanding the learning process of people that go through professional development, and what we can then learn about implications toward implementation of PD into action by teachers. Now you've potentially got a research study. So you see the difference. So whether it's literacy or educational administration or leadership, there should be some sort of problematic situation that you're going to be addressing. So here's basic stems that you can work off of. The purpose of the study is to blank. That's a good stem you can work off of. And if you don't have your problem statement yet, that's an easy stem for you to work with. So from there, you can ask yourself things like, what is the question you seek to answer, right? Ideally, you've got one question or perhaps some sub questions in there. Be careful about setting yourself up with research questions that are too broad and too vague. Think of a research question metaphorically, kind of like good educational objectives. Because, as you know from lesson planning, and as a leader in the field, I assume that I don't know you yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of you watching this video might be principals. As you know, a good educational objective should be tied to assessments and learning gains, right? Uh, I wouldn't, if I'm a curriculum specialist in my past, I wouldn't want a teacher saying, my objective for this lesson is that children will play. My objective in this lesson is that children will have fun. Well, okay, so what? What does that mean in terms of assessment? What does that mean in terms of specific learning gains? You know, the Bloom's taxonomy, action verbs, and so forth. Same metaphor goes when you try to form your research question. Think of something that is measurable. Think of something that you can test. Think of something that you can clearly define. Now you've got a possible research study. Don't be vague. A vague research question can quickly turn into a long process in which you have a hard time getting your committee to approve your dissertation proposal. And really, your committee should not approve a dissertation proposal if the research question is too vague, if it's too poorly defined, because dissertation research questions that are poorly defined, that are too vague, that can be answered in so many different ways, can potentially lead toward one of those nightmare dissertations that might take 3, 4 or more years, with the student possibly winding up ABD, all but dissertation. You don't want that. One reason why, because I don't know if you already have a committee or not, or maybe I might wind up on your committee, who knows. But if I'm on your committee, one reason why I would push you to have a very clearly defined specific research question or research questions is because the tighter and the more clearly defined your research question is, the quicker you can get through your chapter 4 and chapter 5, and the more specifically you can get through your findings and your implication sections. The nightmare scenario is that you could wind up all over the place in chapter 4 and chapter 5 if your research question or research questions are too vague. If you've got too many research questions, that can again mean that you're taking a very long time if it were to be approved, because now in chapter 4 and chapter 5, you've got to answer all of those research questions, and you've got to defend that you've adequately measured how to answer all of those research questions. And you can have potentially some difficult questions coming up from members of the committee. So make your dissertation narrow, specific, but still actionable, and still in a way that relevantly answers the research literature with implications for practice. Think of your hypothesis. Think of what you're going to test and what you think you're going to find, if it's quantitative. Obviously, dissertations can be quantitative, they can be qualitative, they can also be mixed methods. It wouldn't surprise me if you wind up with a mixed method study given this field, because that's pretty popular in the leadership field. And in the leadership field, as well as the educational administration field, it tends to be pretty common to have quantitative dissertations. That would not surprise me if you don't have one yet. And then think about the possible implications, like I said, especially in your field. Yes, you want to have a research question, but the research question really should be tied to some sort of practical application. Like I've been saying, you want to have your research problem as well as your research question to be very precise. Avoid ambiguity, and we on the committee, whoever your committee is, we really should know exactly what you're studying and why you're studying it. If you can't answer those two things, you're going to have a hard time getting a proposal accepted in your committee. So you should spell out very specifically and explicitly what is the intention of your investigation. Explain exactly how you're going to collect data and how you're going to analyze the data. Obviously, your chapter 3 goes into that in good detail. But even in chapter 1, I should have an idea. If I'm reading a chapter 1, I should have a basic idea of these things. Like I said, your purpose of the study is analogous to an objective in a lesson plan. You should think about that because it should be very clearly defined, very actionable, very testable. From there, like I've been saying, think about the how and the why of your study very carefully. And so, for instance, you should establish how are you going to conduct your study? Why are you conducting this specific study? The how and the why of your research question. Your problem statement, what's the problem in the field, should lead directly to your exact research question or research questions. The purpose of the study is based upon the problem that you identify, as well as the question. You want to be very, very clear. A very clear statement of the research problem, very clear statement of expected findings and research hypothesis, and I should see this right in chapter 1. A very clear method of collecting and analyzing data. This will again be further explored in chapter 3, of course. You should give me a hypothesis, predicted results. And I should know when I'm going through, let's say, a dissertation proposal, I should be able to hear you speak very clearly about your hypothesis, your predicted results that you think you're going to find when you do chapter 4. And what implications do you expect to find? And then, of course, you will explore those implications in chapter 5. You want to think about the background of the problem. And this goes again toward chapter 2. Remember, it's very important to be iteratively, cyclically, studying the research literature as you're studying chapter 1. And you really never stop studying the research literature because remember, when you do your chapter 5, your implications and section of your dissertation, go back and review what you wrote in chapter 2 because the literature needs to be informing your implications. There should be a very tight connection between your findings, the research literature, and the implications. This is why it's so important to be doing a strong literature review throughout your dissertation process. This goes toward breadth as well as depth of the work, and you need to have a strong understanding of breadth and depth of research in the field. If you're studying reflective thinking, for instance, of teachers in the context of professional development, then you really need to know what Donald Schoen has said, and going back to John Dewey's understanding of reflective thinking and so forth. I need to see that you've explored it. Are you understanding the differences between different ways of defining critical reflection? And are you looking at it in, for instance, a progressive way that's understood by John Dewey, or a critical reflection way as informed by critical pedagogy as understood by Jack Mazzero? Those are very different ways of doing it. And so if I'm asking you those questions in your proposal phase, you need to be able to have an answer and a why about that. So provide foundation to support your specific expected findings as the next logical step as you research into your question. Notice the cyclical process all the way. So from there, understand the background of this research problem that you're looking into. What have experts already been asking and answering about this research problem? A lot of times I do have doctoral students tell me that such and such has not been looked into before. Generally speaking, what that tends to tell me is that probably the doctoral student hasn't looked into the research literature well enough, because a lot of times a doctoral student is not the first person to have thought about a problem. If you've thought about a problem, chances are others have too. Now, it's possible that a research problem may not have been investigated well enough from the standpoint of empirical research, for instance. Like in the literacy field, it's not uncommon to find areas of problems in areas of debate that have a lack of empirical research as defined by experimental based, design based studies. That's not uncommon. That happens with things like drop everything and read programs and all that stuff. So, and it's possible you could find that too. For instance, the connection between within the reading field, the connection between phonemic awareness and music has a lack of studies um, in that area that meet uh, what we would look for by empirical design-based research that's validated. There's a lot of research about it, but it's not empirical and not design-based. So you see the difference. There you might find an issue. So again, define exactly what you mean by something. Discuss the range of possible methods that you're considering, and carefully reference that we do recommend APA 6th edition. Obviously, there is a 7th edition out there, but generally speaking, your committee is looking for the APA 6th edition here at UA Little Rock. The differences between the 7th edition and 6th edition aren't all that major anyway. Honestly, the 6th edition is a little bit easier to work with. If you have to go through your entire reference section of your dissertation and put the DOIs, for instance, the DOI number, then that would take you longer. We're frankly saving you a little bit of work when it comes to 6th edition versus 7th edition. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework, but next week, in the next video that I make, I'm going to go into this a little bit deeper, because a lot of people have a hard time figuring out what's the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework, as well as what is a theoretical framework. Think of it this way. What key theory holds your dissertation together? That's the theoretical framework. Think of a framework kind of like a house. Right now you can see from the background I'm in Florida visiting my father for the summer. The framework for this house are basically the beams, the structures, and so forth that holds the house together. The house would fall apart without a stable framework. Same thing goes for your theoretical framework in the dissertation. If you don't have a strong theoretical base for your dissertation falls apart. And not everyone should have the same theoretical framework. Your theoretical framework should be consistently informing what research methods you're choosing, what research question you're asking. I should see consistency in there. For instance, let's say hypothetically you're using a social constructivist theoretical framework that is in line with Vygotsky's way of thinking. I find that's very common here at UALR, especially in the reading program. A lot of students are very deeply into Vygotskian ways of thinking. If I see that as your theoretical framework, then your research question, as well as your methods, should be consistent with social constructivist thought. That means the social aspect. That means interaction, right? If you've got a research question and research methods that are not consistent with Vygotsky and social constructivist thought, then you're going to need to change one or the other. Either you change your research question to match your theoretical framework, or you change your theoretical framework to match your dissertation. For instance, if you're getting into self-efficacy, then your theoretical framework needs to be consistent with Bandura, which means, of course, a social cognitive way of looking at things. Which is different than Vygotsky. So again, you need to think about these things. When it comes to your theoretical frameworks, just a little bit deeper into this. And again, I'm going to work with you about theoretical framework again next week too. I've got a separate presentation next week about theoretical framework and conceptual framework. You want to include, when you do your presentation, a slide on the philosophical orientation of your dissertation. That means in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, I also need to be able to identify in writing what is the philosophical orientation to your dissertation. What learning theories, for instance, are informing you? And are you informed by critical theory, which of course gets into critical pedagogy? Um, or are you informed by, for instance, social cultural? And within the social cultural, which means Vygotsky, you've got sub-theories that are involved. There is no one single sociocultural theory. There are sociocultural theories out there, including cultural historical activity theory and communities of practice, outlooks, and others that you want to think about. If you warning, if you have me on your dissertation committee, I'm going to want you to be able to identify this very, very specifically. And as we work together over the summer, let's work on helping you be able to identify what theory or theories are deeply informing your dissertation. So then we get into conceptual framework. There is a difference between the theoretical and conceptual framework. I'll give you an example. Let's say hypothetically you're looking into zone of proximal development. And if you're working with teachers in professional development, how is the gains that teachers are making demonstrating itself in terms of improved practice as evidence as they progress along that ZPD. Again, the ZPD is the difference between what a learner, be it a teacher or a student, what a learner can do with independently versus what a learner can do with guidance. There's the old saying that what a person or a student can do with guidance and with assistance today, in the future, that a person will be able to do with independently. The ZPD is not the theoretical framework. The ZPD is the conceptual framework, hypothetically. The ZPD is not a theory. The ZPD is a concept. The ZPD stems from a sociocultural learning theory of Vygotsky. It stems from Vygotsky's theory of how students learn. So again, notice something. You've got the learning theory, you've got the theoretical framework, and from the theoretical framework come certain concepts. And these concepts form major categories in your literature review. And it's what you're studying. For instance, if you're studying sociocultural learning theory, then the specific concept that might inform you would be ZPD. Notice framework filters down into conceptual. So give enough information to make it very clear that you have a strong understanding of the literature, and make sure you're properly citing. A little bit about your research question. These are some stems that you can use. What is the relationship between? And your research question, of course, informs the methods that you use. Make sure your methods are appropriate for answering the question. When you're looking for relationships, you might do a correlational analysis. What would happen if? Then we might be doing a case study, or we might be there's all kinds of things. What would happen if you might be doing an experimental design research? What is the perspective of such and such? That might lead to a historical analysis, right? Or it might lead to a survey. The proposal must conform in scope to the realistic limitation of the research process. That's extremely important. One nightmare scenario that I see way too many times is that dissertations become designed that might potentially take years to complete. Your dissertation is not supposed to take a lifetime. Make sure that you've got a tightly defined, well-designed research study that you can do in a timely manner. If you wind up taking with a dissertation that's way too broad in scope, then You could wind up taking a very long time on your dissertation and wind up getting frustrated. Let's face it, life happens with those sort of marathon dissertations. You don't want that. Now we're going to talk briefly about methods and limitations. Um, Obviously, you're going to work out your methods and limitations with your methodologist, be it Dr. Nolan or someone else who's your methodologist. The methods need to be very much precise enough to very clearly address your research question in the most logical manner possible. Part of validity and reliability means that you are adequately answering the question that's actually asked with data that's relevant and in the most trustworthy, logical way possible. The methods should be part of your well-constructed research design in Chapter 3. And like I've been saying, the methods that you choose should line up with your theoretical framework. A little bit more about what I look for in research methods. Clearly define which major category of research you are using for your dissertation. That gets into your conceptual framework. Are you looking at professional development? If so, what aspect of professional development are you looking at? Are you looking at critical thinking of your teachers? Are you looking at change in identities as understood by perhaps Deborah Britzman, right? So depending on what you're looking at, that's going to inform you. If you're getting into Britzman, you should be getting into a little bit of postmodernism and post-structuralism as well as critical theory. So it depends on who you're looking at, what your framework is, that's going to strongly shape it. And again, why is a particular theoretical and conceptual framework appropriate for your research question? And of course, all the way through, make sure you're starting properly. Think some about your participants. Now, of course, your methodologist will help you on that. Reliability and validity, that's crucial. Think of the methods section is what's going to hold your dissertation together. If your methods section is weak or poorly defined, your dissertation is going to fall apart. Limitations are important, especially in this era of COVID-19 and so on and so forth. Is your dissertation one that's actually doable? Can you do a dissertation under the current conditions that you're working under? Think about location, time, think about variables. All these things need to be considered as you are doing your dissertation. And as part of your chapter 3, I should see well spelled out the delimitations and limitations of your dissertation. Any good research design will be upfront about what the limitations are. And of course, toward the end of your chapter 1, I should see very clearly defined terms. This is very important. Don't get into situations where you're assuming that we already know exactly how to define a particular term. Because, number one, the people reading your dissertation might not have your same level of expertise. That's an obvious point. But there's also a more important reason why you need to clearly define your terms. There are many terms out there that can have different meanings to different people depending on what your particular theoretical framework is. Like I said earlier, the term critical reflection. Critical reflection can mean different things depending on whether you're looking at a learner-centered Deweyan way of defining critical reflection or whether you're defining it in the way that those scholars who are tied to critical pedagogy and critical literacy would look at critical thinking, critical reflection. There's a very different way between the way that, for instance, Donald Schoen and David Kember, drawing on John Dewey, would define critical reflection, and the way that, let's say, Jack Mezirow would define critical reflection. So be very, very drawing on, of course, Paulo Freire. So be very, very specific here. I could name a number of terms that are like this that we need to very clearly define because they can be defined in various ways. Take a basic terms from a field that I often work with reading, the term comprehension.
In everyday discourse, you might assume that comprehension means the same thing to everyone. No, it doesn't actually. Comprehension can be variously defined in the literature, and there's big debates over how we define and look at reading comprehension, and how you define it very strongly shapes your research as well as your practice. As a little bit of a reminder here, a strong dissertation, your chapter 1 goes into what will you study and why. Chapter 2, you've got your literature review. Chapter 3 are your methods. Your dissertation proposal is basically chapters 1, 2, and 3 very well spelled out. Now, it's possible there may be some editing involved in chapter 1, 2, and 3, but you really should have your chapter 1, 2, and 3 very solid in order to get through your dissertation proposal. At that point, you go before IRB, and IRB, after the committee has approved your chapter 1, 2, and 3, the IRB will then give you permission to start collecting data. Here are some basic do's and don'ts for your dissertation. Do select when you give your dissertation proposal before the committee. Make your slide layout relatively conservative. Make it easy to read. Don't get too fancy. Don't pick out some sort of risky font that some people might have a hard time even reading. For instance, Times New Roman or something similar is very safe. It is wise to use figures and tables very clearly. Don't make your font too small. Don't have all kinds of dancing cartoons on your slides and animation and distracting sounds. Remember, the entire focus of your dissertation proposal when you're standing before the committee is for you to get approved. We're not evaluating you on how fancy your slides are. When you give your oral presentation, you do want to have notes that can be seen just by you that will remind you about what to discuss and what not to discuss. You don't want to get it to a situation where you're making a presentation and you forget to say something that you really want to make sure that you're saying. So that's where the importance of notes comes in. I don't want you to be in a situation where you're just simply reading the slides to people. This needs to be a situation where we know that you know what you're talking about. If you're sitting there kind of reading through your slides, I'll be very honest, some questions are going through my mind about whether you know your material well enough, and I might ask you some pretty sharp questions because members of the committee, yeah, you should know your research literature very well because ideally you're studying the research literature depending on your topic, perhaps even deeper than I've ever studied it, especially given the fact that my PhD is not at leadership or educational administration. My PhD is curriculum and instruction, so there's a very good chance that if I were to hypothetically wind up on your committee, there's a very good chance that you might know this particular bend of the research literature better than I do by the time you're done. But even that being said, if a member of your committee wants to ask you a question that might throw you a little bit, we know what questions to ask. You don't want to get yourself in that situation. That comes from preparation. Make sure that we know that you are well prepared. A thing that I'll add with the do and don't is your presentation is going to be about 30 to 35 minutes. Then there'll be time for some questions, some discussions. Then we'll ask you to let us talk in private for a little bit. You might be put in a breakout room that lasts for about 5-10 minutes, typically no more than that. And then you come back, and generally speaking, we might give you some revisions, we might give you some editing, but hopefully we're going to approve your proposal when you're standing before us. One thing that I want you to avoid is when we start getting into discussions, even if we might seem like we're smiling and we're going along with you, it might seem easygoing. Don't trust us too much, because if you go off script and you start saying something that you might not think twice about, but it triggers me to realize, okay, you just said something that shows me you haven't studied the research literature well enough. And you may not even realize you said it when you say it. Now the next thing I know, that's going to potentially raise some questions in my mind about your dissertation itself. And I might ask you to go back and look at something a little bit more deeply. So be careful about going off script. You could find yourself in trouble if you go off script. Then we get into chapter 4. Again, I want you to be thinking ahead into hypotheses for chapter 4 and chapter 5, even if you're right now in the proposal stage. Again, I do not know the two of you in this course, and to the best of my knowledge, there's only going to be two of you, although there might be more that sign up. I'm not exactly sure where you stand on that. For all I know, you already might be doing chapter 4. Your chapter 4 is, of course, your findings section. You start working on chapter 4 after you get IRB approval and after your proposal has been approved by your committee. You want to present enough detail that your dissertation defense of chapter 4 can be convincing. And you can have a lot of detail in the actual writing of your dissertation, but the presentation itself, when you're doing your oral presentation, your oral presentation defense, don't get lost in the weeds. Remember, 30 to 35 minutes. Tables are appropriate, drawing on what's in your written dissertation. Focus on the most significant details. And focus on how the findings specifically relate to your research question. That way, your written dissertation as well as your oral defense of your dissertation will sound to me like it is very specific and very focused. Chapter 5, your conclusion sections. You can think ahead of time, hypothesizing what do you expect to learn from your dissertation. When you come down to actually writing chapter 5 and orally defending it, I do want to see what did you learn about research as well as what did you learn about practice. How are your findings related to implications for practice? How are the findings related to the framework in the literature, your theoretical framework? Again, notice your theoretical framework should be tied through and through. Discuss strengths, weaknesses, as well as the limitations to your work. There is no dissertation that's ever been written without some limitations, some possible weaknesses. That's okay. Just be able to discuss it. And there should also be strengths, right? Some further thoughts on your chapter 5. What are some implications for future research? For instance, if you were to expand the study and do further research based upon the study in the future, what more would you want to do? And what more would you advise other people to do? If you read a good research article in the research literature journals, you should often see scholars talk about recommendations for future research. Your dissertation should have some recommendations for future research, as well as some implications for future practice. And how does this clarify our understanding and relate to our understanding of theoretical concepts? Think about possible changes in our understanding of theory, possible changes for public policy, for administration, for leadership studies, and possible changes in practice. All of that should be addressed within your chapter 5.